Dr. Leigha Saunders. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me, Shyamala. I'm really excited to be here.
I'm so excited that you're here as well. And I know that you have such a passion for sleep. And I was just saying to you before we hit record that I am selfishly going to use this as an opportunity to totally pick your brain about my own sleep. So I'm certainly someone who, if I don't have good quality of sleep, it has a huge impact on me. And anyway, I'll tell you my sleep story as we get started. But before we go there, what I'd love to start with is for you to just share with the audience. You know, I've shared your bio in the beginning, but just a little bit more about who you are, and really, you know, what led you to this particular area, this particular niche, and what makes you so passionate about sleep as your mission.
Sure. So I'm Dr. Leigha, and I'm absolutely obsessed with helping women get a good night's sleep so they can do what sets their soul on fire during the day. And so just like you said, Shyamala, you know, so many of us, women in particular, I think exist in this chronic state of exhaustion and really get stuck in thinking it's just the way that it has to be, and really do notice when they take the time that their sleep impacts how they can function, how clearly they can think, how well they can perform and communicate during the day, but really get stuck in this trap of not knowing what they can do to improve it, or feeling like there's nothing that they can do to improve it. And so my story is not I became a new mom. I really struggle with my sleep, which is understandable.
Leah, sorry, I'm going to totally cut out. So maybe we can just start that part again.
It's a silly internet here. What part did I cut out at?
Basically
the whole thing.
Yeah. for your intro.
Over to okay, let me stream from my phone.
Okay.
And that way that should be a whole lot better. Okay, just start over. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, just go.
Well, you know it's not live.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. No, you're right. Okay. So let's just go back to kind of who you are, what you do, sure, and really why this is your mission.
Sure. So I'm Dr. Leigha, and I am absolutely obsessed with helping other women get a good night's sleep so they can do what sets their soul on fire during the day. And just like you alluded to, Shyamala, at the beginning, so many women notice this connection between how well or maybe how not well they're sleeping at night and how they're performing during the day, or how they're feeling during the day. How their mental health is, how easy it is for them to focus on any given task, how their emotions are during the day. And they get stuck often in this place of feeling like there's nothing they can do. It's just kind of what they have to live with in terms of it being exhaustion during the day, and then really restless sleep at night, or maybe just not enough sleep as they want to get. And so this started becoming so much more in my awareness and so much more real to me when I became a new mom. So it's not a new story. It's not a unique story per se, but in my journey into motherhood, I really started to understand, after going through postpartum sleep deprivation and really struggling with sleep myself. So after my son started to go back to, or started to sleep through the night, I actually couldn't. And so I would be awake even though he was asleep, and there is nothing worse in the world when you want to be asleep, but are lying there awake. And so I started to realize how many women experience that, maybe from the time of having kids, but then just live with it for years, and or face different sleep challenges with mental health concerns, or after going through grief or periods of stress or pandemic or menopause, all kinds of different life events. And then realizing my patients in particular who get better, they sleep well. And my patients who I've seen for a very long time, when I actually started to realize, I'm like, wow, those are often also the people who aren't sleeping great. And I literally jumped down the rabbit hole of all things sleep research once I realized that that was the missing piece for me. I wasn't going to get back to feeling like myself until I could feel rested and restored and actually have the fuel that my brain needed to function to my highest capability during the day. So I listened to all the podcasts and read all the books and researched all the articles and did all the things to really figure out. And then I fixed my sleep. And now I'm bringing that to other women and really want to help women understand that there's so much they can do to sleep better at night. So like I said, they can jump in the day and feel energized and excited and really move away from burnout into passion fueled work, regardless of what that is for them.
I love this. And it just, I'm listening and I'm like, I often talk about with people that know me well, family, friends that are close to me. I talk about literally the hardest part. You talk about motherhood. The hardest part of motherhood for me was those first 6 months. And, I had a C-section. So there was like physical pain, all kinds of things going on. But really the hardest part was the fatigue. Like it just made it so difficult for me to think clearly, for me to self-regulate. My moods were all over the place. And it was just the unbelievable fatigue. And truth be told, as I moved through that stage and things got better, you're right. It's since motherhood that I've noticed that my sleep is like one of my most precious commodities. And if I don't have it, there's such a huge impact. So I'd love to just jump right in and talk a little bit about, because I think that any woman listening, I think this is going to resonate. The idea that sleep absolutely affects our moods. So can you tell us a little bit about like why that is, how that is?
Yeah, there's so many layers to it. So if we look at it from a bird's eye view and say we're just short sleeping, so that by definition is actually getting less than 7 hours of sleep on a regular basis. And I encourage everyone to start tracking their sleep. So there's some great apps like Sleep Cycle you can use, or you can, wear your Fitbit or get an Oura Ring, which I'm not wearing mine today, which I realized I'm missing it. It feels strange to not have it on my hand. But these devices will help you track your sleep, which brings a huge awareness to people and women, because we tend to over and underestimate all kinds of things, and especially around our behavior. So a lot of people actually overestimate the amount of sleep that they get. And they think that because they're in bed for say 8 hours, they're actually getting 8 hours of sleep when you might only be getting 6 or 6.5, right? So by definition, and that's short sleeping, which we know then will increase risk of chronic disease across the board. And if we look at how it relates to mental health, we'll see people struggle more or be more likely to struggle with anxiety and depression and mental health concerns of any kind if they're not getting adequate quantity sleep and then quality. So if we break that down further and say, let's look at all of the different stages of sleep, which is non-REM and REM. Stage 1 and 2 of non-REM sleep being light sleep. And then we move into REM, which is when we dream. And then stage 4 being that really deep restorative sleep. So REM is one important thing to look at, because it's Matthew Walker, who wrote Why We Sleep, which is a fantastic book, calls it emotional first aid. And so we need adequate amounts of REM over the course of the night to really push through and regulate and kind of put into essentially like the wastebasket to say like, okay, we don't need this anymore. And then to consolidate different memories and to heal the emotions that we go through over the course of the day, which is sometimes why we say, like sleep on it. And so something that feels really big and overwhelming one day after a good night's sleep, you wake up feeling like, okay, I can do this, I can face this, or it seems a little less daunting. In the same way that you might wake up in the middle of the night and be thinking about all the world's problems, and then wake up in the morning after getting back to sleep and think like, why was I so worked up about that at 3 a.m.? And so we get most of our REM sleep from about 1 or 2 a.m. onwards. But a lot of our habits interrupt our ability to get good quality REM. So that's how we start dissecting and really looking at it to say, okay, if we're looking at emotional regulation, if we're looking at how easy it is for you to focus and concentrate during the day, are you getting enough deep restorative sleep that's actually allowing you to do those other things too, like consolidate memory and obviously repair and regenerate your body and brain? But then also, are we getting enough REM sleep so that you can come out on the other side feeling emotionally recharged and regulated?
Yeah. And so I've heard about this, right? Like, obviously I'm not the sleep expert, but I've heard about the importance of that deep sleep. And so how do we, how do we make sure that we are achieving that deep sleep? And I don't mean necessarily from like a tracking perspective. But what I mean is what can we do? What can we do? Like, I know you're really, really religious. Yeah. About your, I think like your sleep hygiene and your routine, right? I'd love to know what are like the tried and true practices and secrets to really help us, you know, ensure that we're getting that deep sleep.
Yeah. So one of the first places to start is to identify your chronotype, which I remember you and I were chatting about it was about a year ago. We had a weekend together. And that's basically your internal body clock. And so it's looking at to say, okay, from a big picture, it's like, are you a morning person or a night owl? And a lot of people will identify with being more of a night owl, which means we really need to look at what you're doing in the evening, because you might actually have to be up by a certain time in the morning, which dictates how much sleep. We need to reverse engineer everything. So when you understand that internal body clock, then you're able to really set up your day for success, for better sleep at night, because it's actually what we start doing from the time we wake up that will start impacting how well we'll sleep that night. So it's not to mean it's like complicated or you've got to do a whole lot of extra things in the day, but it's simple things like saying, okay, if I know I need to be up and out of the door by a certain time or starting work backwards to pick a consistent wake up time, because a consistent wake up time is what's going to help keep your body clock on track really well and actually help you initiate and maintain regular sleep habits over time.
And I've heard even on the weekends, right? Like,
yeah, especially if you are somebody who struggles with sleep, because this idea of social jet lag can come in where you might be needing to get up, let's say at 6 a.m. during the week, but you're a night owl. So you find yourself staying up until 11, 12 or 1 a.m. You're short sleeping during the week because you have to get up by a certain point, and then you use the weekends to stay up later because that's your natural tendency, or you're doing something that you enjoy and then you sleep in. Which, if you think about it, so even sleeping in until say 8 a.m. on Sunday morning, you've jet lagged almost your body 2 hours. And so then come Sunday night, of course, it's going to be difficult for you to fall asleep by 10 o'clock to get your 8 hours in, because you haven't even been awake long enough to actually generate enough sleep pressure, we call it, which is that sensation of being ready for sleep. Like your head is heavy and your eyes are heavy. So for somebody who does struggle with sleep, meaning you struggle to fall asleep easily, or you wake up over the course of the night, or you have a really light or restless sleep, a consistent wake up time is one of the top recommendations to start getting these things back on track.
So that's one of the most important things we could do, is that consistent wake up time, even over the weekend, which is, that's where I struggle. Like during the week, I'm golden.
Yeah.
Right. Like in bed at an amazing time, up at the same time every single morning. But it is over the weekends where I will get that. And it's usually just a couple of hours. Like you said, it's like 8 a.m., 9 a.m. maybe, right?
Yeah. But if you appreciate traveling a time zone that's 2 or 3 hours, it becomes more obvious to us, right? Of like, of course, you're not ready for bed at 10 p.m. when it's still 7 p.m. your body time, right? But we don't always think about that one sleep in can have the same effect. So when we're flip-flopping, then you can start appreciating how difficult it is for shift workers, right? Who are always changing their body clocks to really get consistent good night's sleep. So that's one place to start, is to say, okay, I'm going to pick a consistent wake up time, at least until you're happy or you've noticed that your sleep has started to improve, because then you might be able to find, you know, okay, if I'm typically getting up at 6 and I sleep until 7 or 7:30, it's not too disruptive. But what can masquerade as insomnia for some people. So let's take the Sunday night-itis, I like to call it, when people start transitioning through their Sunday and feeling anxious maybe about what's coming ahead in the week or about Monday. And then they struggle to fall asleep because they're not actually ready for bed. So if you've slept in the morning, we need about 14 to 16 hours of being awake to generate that maximal sleep pressure. And so if you've woken up at, say, 8 a.m., like that doesn't seem like that late, then you're really, really not ready for bed until midnight, Sunday night. And you might be in bed at 10 thinking like, oh, I've got to get up at 6. And you're lying there awake, tossing and turning, feeling frustrated because you're not falling asleep, which makes you feel like, or somebody diagnoses you as having insomnia, when really you're just getting the timing wrong. So,
right. Yeah. That makes sense when you put it in that context, because it feels like, well, it's just a couple hours. What's the big deal? Right. And I think we also have this mentality that weekends are meant to stay up later and wake up later.
Totally. And this is where mindset comes in. It's so key because we have to take that step back and really look at what are we trying to accomplish and do, and where are we setting our boundaries, or maybe becoming a little bit lax about them. And it's not about saying like, don't have fun and stay up late and all of that, but it's about recognizing maybe where you want to be and where you want your energy to be and your focus and your concentration and your daily performance, and how close or far are you from that? And then what are these little actions that you can take every day that either moves you closer to or further away from that goal? So it's funny because a conversation, I was with my in-laws a couple of weeks ago, and my mother-in-law is the opposite. So she is somebody who sleeps in and stays up late. And I'm somebody who gets up quite early, and I'm happy to go to bed early. And she was just curious and asking me some questions and saying like, do you think that really works? Like, maybe you should change it and whatever. And I'm thinking like, you have to do what works for you. Right? Like for me, I love that time in the morning. I get up, I have my morning routine, and that's time when I can actually feel like I can access meditation easily because my mind is blank, somewhat blank.
Yeah,
and
I hear you.
I can enjoy my coffee in quiet. I can open up my computer after I've done those things that I know if I open my computer first, I'm not going to make time to meditate and journal because there's always going to be something else that appears more important. So
Right.
it's asking ourselves those really tough questions of like, what is it that you actually want to do? And those things were a priority for me. So I've built it into my day because I know at the end of the day, like I'm just too tired as well.
Yeah. Yeah. That resonates for me as well. Like if I like my morning time is so important, and my family friends know, like, don't even bother calling me after 9 p.m. or texting me because I'm already like in my wind down. I'm getting ready for bed. I'm looking forward to the next day. Like,
yeah. And that's it's a good segue into the habits that we do at night. Right. So there is this new term that's circulating lately, and it's called revenge bedtime procrastination. So
I've heard you talk about it. Yeah.
Yeah. So it is the idea that, and I'm sure most people listening are be like, that is so me, that we get to the end of our day and we know that we should be in bed by a certain time, but we find ourselves doing something else, like scrolling on social media, checking our email one more time, watching just one more episode on Netflix or whatever it is. And then we're kind of like annoyed with ourselves at the same time, or feel guilty at the end of it because we're like, oh, I wanted to be asleep an hour ago. I'm still awake. I didn't actually do anything that was that fulfilling during this hour. So you're left kind of with this void. And then you try to go to sleep, but maybe you're not ready, or your mind is still racing a little bit or restless because those activities can be stimulating, especially if you're, say, checking or watching the news, or maybe you don't feel super fulfilled from what you've been looking at on social media.
Yeah,
right?
That totally makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. And so this is where the bigger conversation for me, I love having with women, is like, why are we reaching for our phones in the evening at the end of the day in the first place? Because blue light exposure and that screen time exposure is for sure, I would say, like the number one thing that's interfering with our ability to get that deep restorative sleep.
The number one thing.
I would argue that. I don't know if I can pull a stat on it, but I just like, we live in a dark deprived society, right? There's always lights on around us. Our environment is very artificially controlled with temperature and lights, which have a very real impact on our circadian rhythm, which is that internal body clock. And so when we have blue light in our environment, which is natural daylight, it sends a signal to our body and brain saying it's daytime, it's time to be awake, it's time to be alert, keep melatonin levels low. But then as we start to experience increasing darkness into the evening, that's when we get the opposite signal saying, okay, it's starting to ease into the night, start making more melatonin. But when we've got this like blue light right in our face, which is screen time for most people,
right?
Or energy efficient LED light bulbs, which are a wonderful invention, but also can manipulate our body clock. And then we've talked about kind of social jet lag and staying up late on the weekends. We can also experience something called light lag, which is we've experienced or been exposed to so much blue light into the evening that our melatonin levels haven't started to rise to an appropriate level. So our body clock is thinking it's earlier because it's thinking like, okay, here's all this blue light. It must still be daytime. Same thing. People go to bed because it's a certain time, they struggle to fall asleep, or they wake up between 2 and 4 a.m. And that's such a common complaint that I'll hear, is that people say like, well, I fall asleep because I'm so exhausted, but then I wake up at like 3:17. I know what time it is. And so our melatonin production actually peaks in the middle of the night, not at the time we go to bed.
Okay. And so our body continues to produce melatonin as we're sleeping.
As we're sleeping to a maximal point somewhere between 2 and 4. And so this is where it's become really obvious for me as I've tracked my sleep and tagged different habits during the day, which is something you can do on virtually any sleep tracker. And simple example, last week, like you said, I'm usually quite diligent about my evening routine. And Tuesday night, I said, you know what, I don't usually do this, but I'm going to open my computer because I had a project and deadline, whatnot. And I was so tired that day, but I did not have a good sleep. And I should have slept better because even the night before, I had my group call on Monday nights. Like those nights, I know it's stimulating, it's active in the evening, computer time. So I'm like, typically don't sleep well on those nights. Okay. But that carries me through. And then I'm usually tired enough. But that screen time on Tuesday night was just like,
really, like it was a marked impact for you.
Yeah. And I can track it now. And so that's a really great example of how our daytime habits and what we're doing in the evening can really impact our sleep at night.
So what is your what's your recommendation in terms of how we actually manage the blue light screens? Like is there a cutoff? Like tell me how what's like the sort of like best case scenario? Not that all of us are going to follow that, but
sure. Let's do the two sides. So we'll do the intellectual side and we'll do the emotional side.
Let's do that.
So the intellectual side is, like we said, the recommendation is to pick a consistent wake up time. And then from there, you know that your maximal state of sleep pressure should occur 14 to 16 hours later. If you've ever had a second wind, meaning after you've been awake for so long and feeling tired, you suddenly feel more awake. It's typically because you've pushed past that 16-hour mark.
I see.
That's when our
So if my wake up time is 6 a.m.
Yep.
My optimal sleep time would be, do the math for me because I'm really bad at that.
Yep.
It would
between
be
8 and 10
8
p.m.
and 10 p.m., right?
Yep.
Okay. So I should be in bed around there.
Yep. And ideally asleep by 10. So then you're giving yourself an 8-hour sleep window or sleep opportunity between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. Because like I mentioned at the beginning, most of us aren't actually sleeping 100% of the time. But what we do want is to be having, I know you talk about your emotional, like your EQ, your sleep Q and sleep efficiency score, it should be about 85% or higher. Meaning if you divide the amount of time you're actually asleep compared to the amount of time you spend in bed, you should have at least an 85% score.
On sleep. Okay.
Yeah. So the longer time we spend awake in bed, the more we associate it with a place of being awake and alert and not being a place of rest and restoration, which Pavlov's dog, right? So then there's a lot of like anticipatory anxiety that can develop from going to bed, or like you wake up at that exact time every night because your body starts to build these associations.
So if I know I need to be asleep by 10, when do I need to start my evening routine? And in an ideal world, if I was to follow all of Dr. Leigha Saunders' protocols, what would I be doing?
Yeah. So the recommendation is to avoid screen time 1 to 2 hours before your bedtime. And that starts to do a couple of different things. So one, you're going to limit the blue light exposure. You can also turn off about 50% of the lights in your home and start to use more low level lighting, like lights or lamps or dimmers.
I like that.
And it starts to mimic. So it's interesting because we'll do a couple of different things with that. We lower the light we're exposed to, but we also start to mimic a sunset with lamps and horizontal level lighting.
Interesting. Yeah.
Which again sends a signal back into our brain that the sun is setting. Stuff we don't consciously register, but are totally primal responses that are
I would have never thought of that. Yeah.
Yeah. And so then the question is always like, well, what am I going to do when I unplug for 1 or 2 hours? And that's where the emotional piece comes in, because we need to ask ourselves, why are we reaching for our phone and why are we constantly on it? And what are we looking for in that activity? Because it's so often wanting to connect with others, which is valid, and or wanting to distract ourselves from our own internal dialogue.
I'm laughing. I know people listening to the podcast can't see, but I've got this huge like giggle look on my face because I remember being in my bed on the phone, messaging you on Instagram. We were like in a DM conversation. And so of course this was like after the time that I should have been on my phone messaging. And Leah's like, okay, Shyamala, I can't remember what you said, but basically it was like signing off. It's like, I gotta go. It's like I don't know if you called it your nighttime routine, but you said something really, like you set that boundary and you're like, okay, gotta go, gotta get ready for bed. I'll check back in tomorrow morning. I was like, I should probably do the same thing. The sleep doctor is going to bed. I better do the same thing.
It's so true. And that's it. It's boundaries, right? Because there's always one more thing to do in the day or an endless list of things that you could do. And so the idea behind bedtime or revenge bedtime procrastination that I was talking about earlier is that we feel such a lack of control, a perceived lack of control over what's happening in our days. Meaning you might feel overscheduled, you might feel overwhelmed, you might not feel fully supported in whatever aspect of your life. And we're not taking breaks. We're not checking in with ourselves. We're not expressing how we're truly feeling. And those things build up. And at the end of the day, we kind of subconsciously probably know that, but choose to reach for our phone, which distracts us, or watch TV or fall asleep to TV because we're avoiding filtering through our own thoughts.
This makes so much, I find this fascinating, makes so much sense because I'm even just sort of reflecting on why do I do that, right? Like why I almost feel like it's like this like reward or something. Like I'm giving myself this, okay, I'm going to like chillax, grab my phone. I'm going to scroll. I'm going to like, connect with friends, send the DMs, like do whatever it is that I haven't had an opportunity. And that's exactly what it is some of my days can be so full and so overscheduled, as you say it, that I don't feel like I've had the opportunity to do those things during the day. And so I reach for it in the evening. And I never really thought about it that way.
Yeah. And if it doesn't show up then, because some people are like, well, I fall asleep, no problem. It probably shows up in the night when you wake up and then your mind starts racing or jumping from thought to thought, or you find it difficult to get back to sleep if you've woken up. So it doesn't have to be super complicated, but just building in those breaks, right? During the day, actually eating your lunch without looking at a screen, or going for a walk or a workout without making everything have to be productive. And I'm a recovering productivity addict myself. Like I get that time is precious, especially of course, once you have kids or running a business or have a high profile job, like all of these elements of your time, you think you can squeeze one more thing in, but it's also extremely therapeutic to like go for a walk without listening to a podcast at the same time. And then, using that time to actually filter through your own thoughts and feelings, because if it hasn't happened during the day, then it will probably show up at night.
That's such great, such amazing insight and such, I think, a useful perspective for us to really think about. And it's certainly causing me as we're talking to really self-reflect on some of those patterns in my own life. And I can certainly see how that's exactly what's happening, right? Is like, I think at the end of the day, as human beings, we look for opportunities. We need to process. So if we're not giving ourselves the time to slow down and to process and to just filter through our own thoughts, then our body and our mind are we're going to seek that somewhere.
Totally.
Right. And I can see how that really does affect our sleep.
So pick a time where you say like, I will unplug by that. So for me, 8:30 is always my goal. And that's, sometimes I'm just super honest in conversations where I'm like, I want to check in, I want to connect with friends, whatever. But then I also will say, okay, I'm going to sign off now, or I'm unplugging or whatever, because I've tracked it so many times. And that's why I encourage people to do it, because then it's not just me saying you shouldn't do that. You're getting the objective measurement, and then you can track things like how late or how close you eat to bedtime, when you drink wine and how close that is to your bedtime, when you exercise, if you have had a stressful day, if you've worked out, if you've done yoga, if you've meditated, then you can start tracking all of these things and really start to gather the data to figure out what works best for your body.
I love this. This is
Mhm.
so helpful, so practical and so helpful.
It's awesome
Mhm.
because
It really is.
there's no other productivity hack like sleep.
I
And
agree.
sleep impacts every single aspect of our health. So when you're looking at, recovering from a physical condition or managing a physical condition, improving athletic performance, addressing mental health, productivity, like
Hmm.
somebody was sharing a story the other day of Jeff Bezos of Amazon and saying, somebody asked him about his sleep, or he made some commentary somewhere where he's like, I make sure that's a priority and I have to get my 8 hours. And somebody asked him, well, how can you do that? Don't you have to do so much in a day? And his response
Mm,
was something to the effect of, when you get to the level where I am, you don't have to make a lot of decisions, but you have to make a few very big ones.
mm,
And those big decisions can put you in one direction or another. And he just echoed the importance of having great sleep so he can be so clear-minded
right.
and motivated to focus on and think of those decisions instead of feeling emotionally unregulated,
And
right?
this, yeah, and this is exactly it, right? I think for me and actually so many of the women that I work with, we often talk about this idea that, when we don't have enough sleep, when we're not, and it's for me, it's another aspect of self-care, right? It's just
Mm-hmm.
another configuration of self-care, just the impact that it has on our ability to self-regulate with
Mm-hmm.
then translates into how we're relating to others, how we're leading at work, how we're showing up, in parenting, like all of those different
Mm-hmm.
areas. There's just this ripple effect.
Yeah. And there's so many fascinating studies too. And one of them is mentioned in Why We Sleep by Matthew Walker. And he talks about how people who have short slept also have difficulty reading the emotions of others. So it becomes this vicious cycle of, say, if you take two people who are underslept, one's ability to lead is going to be compromised, and say the employee is then going to have difficulty recognizing their emotional cues and social cues, and will tend to catastrophize, really,
Mm-hmm.
and think, that one little remark was that, we magnify it
Right, right.
in our
It's funny.
mind.
Yeah. Yeah. It reminds me of a conversation that I had with a mutual friend of ours for the podcast a little while ago, Dr. Jordan Robertson. And we talked about how the very same is true around PMS, right? And our moods and our hormones, how it actually can affect our ability to read facial expressions, tone of voice. So it's fascinating to hear how some of these experiences, I think, that we can have, particularly as women, in terms of how we're communicating, how we're relating, how we're self regulating, that there really is science behind that, right? That there
Mm-hmm.
really is something to this, and that all these pieces sort of play a part in terms of how we're showing up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so I think in that realm, to look at, what are you, reflect on, what are you looking for in that time in the evening? And maybe part of that is like, I'm going to have a half an hour on my phone and enjoy it and catch up with the people that you want to connect with. Of course, that's important. And then to maybe build out that time to say, what do I need to unwind? So for some people, that might be a hot bath or shower. It might be reading, it might be journaling, it might be listening to a guided meditation or doing some yoga or light stretches. But typically we need something like that in our day at some point to really just allow our own thoughts to filter and emotions to filter, so that we can go to bed with a calmer mind.
I love that. Leigha,
Mm-hmm.
thank you so much. This was such a practical, insightful, and useful conversation. Could you tell our audience where they can go to find you? We'll include it in the show notes, but I'd love for you to share with our audience where they could
Sure.
go to learn more about you.
Yeah. So as I mentioned, I have gone through all of the research and figured out what people need to do, because I've been there. So I can save you hours of Googling and hours and nights feeling rested and tossing and turning. I've created the Sleep Fix, and it's my methodology and my program for women who want to understand and identify and then fix their broken sleep so they can do what sets their soul on fire during the day, so you can wake up feeling rested and refreshed and energized and excited. So you can access that at thesleepfix.com. And I'm most active on Instagram at Dr. Leigha Saunders ND. So we can hang out there.
Amazing. Dr. Leigha, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.